When Metaphor Refantazio was first revealed back in December 2023, my interest was piqued immediately. And then, as new trailers came out detailing the story, the world, and the combat, that interest grew rapidly, becoming one of my most anticipated games of last year. And now, having finally finished it, I can safely say that my pre-release curiosity was justified, and then some, because this is the best game I played in 2024. Metaphor Refantazio is so much more than a Persona spin-off. Despite the similarities, the game implements inventive ways to evolve the familiar systems. The more turn-based combat, social links, reward systems, and character builds have all been taken to new heights here. Escaping the hallways of a high school classroom for a grander fantasy world defined by contemporary issues allows the storytelling to excel while exploring more adult themes like child loss, racism, class structure, faith, and questioning what utopia means. Whisked away to this dystopian world, the player is free to learn of its people, its conflicts, and what it means to be a leader hardened by inner strength of will. Familiar JRPG storytelling tropes endure here, but are given a breath of fresh air owed to the scale of the story and the nature of the setting. Both the party members and you, the player, must grapple with challenge, whether it be a character overcoming deep-seated anxiety or you defeating a tough opponent through proper strategy. A truly unique art direction paired with an iconic soundtrack will fuel your journey in moments both robust and quiet. And at the heart of it all is a strong thematic emphasis on the power of personal conviction, a message that will resonate with all. The package offered here is incredible, and I hope to convey that along with some criticisms throughout this lengthy review. Perhaps the most praise I can push on this game up front is that Persona 6 will feel like a lesser experience if it plays things safe and doesn't find ways to include the exemplary advancements found here. And with that, join me for my full review of Metaphor Refantazio. And beware, there will be major story spoilers ahead, so watch this at your own risk. One of the best feelings in video games is discovering a brand new fantasy world for the first time, exploring its terrains and uncovering its cultures. In an era where sequels dominate, there's something special about being dropped off in a reality that you aren't familiar with, especially one with a AAA budget and an emboldened design. Metaphor Refantazio is but the most recent evidence of this truth. Our setting for the adventure is the world of Ukrainia, a country made up of 3 former warring countries, now all united under the King's banner. An annexation war brought Montario and Oceania under the control of Ukrainia, merging into one nation defined in part by its otherworldly sites. And now, 200 years later, with civil unrest already at an all-time high, tragedy strikes. The broken king, Hythlodaeus V, is assassinated in his sleep, which kicks off our journey. More on this in a bit, but essentially, your goal as the player is to earn the now vacant throne by venturing through the world and convincing people of your merit. After all, a strong magical spell has ensured that the next king will be selected by the will of the people, a true democratic system taking place for the first time in this land. And with that, your journey across this wonderfully crafted world is set in motion. Navigation plays a bigger role here in Metaphor compared to the Persona games, as often your free time isn't spent in one isolated city, but instead while traveling through the countryside to reach distant towns, villages, and temples, while considering each trip carefully, keeping the weather forecast in mind. To be clear, much of the landscape in Metaphor remains largely unexplorable, owed to the game's more linear areas. This is not an open world game after all. However, plenty of pit stops will be found throughout your journey. This includes venturing into cities and towns like Brylehaven, the capital of Oceania that sits on the sea's edge, defined best by the majestic aquatic spheres towering out of the water. And then there's the town of Martira, a somewhat isolated village owed to the nearby harsh deserts. And then there's Etria, an island civilization full of rich vistas both on land and at sea, and these are but 3 of the 5 major cities in-game. And between each of these major locations are a series of beautiful vistas presented with an incredible level of artistic vision. Many of them strike you as natural beauties, locations that tourists would flock to, lands so breathtaking that they ought to be protected for generations to come. While you can't explore these in-game, they provide a sense of wonder and intrigue to the world, conjuring up images of what else lies beyond the borders of your TV screen. But with beauty comes danger, as the world is also home to many dungeons, both man-made towers and tombs, as well as forests and deserts, although many of these do end up feeling overly familiar by the game's end, often reusing setups and ideas from previous dungeons. Regardless, despite not being fully explorable, a real sense of place is thrust upon you as you uncover new areas across this sprawling map. Of course, anyone who's played this game will tell you that Uchronia is much more defined by its people, their cultures, and their beliefs versus any geographical beauty. One of my personal favorite things about video games is how they present cultures and ideologies, and how they interact and conflict amongst one another. Metaphor Refantazio provides this in spades by creating a rich set of 9 different species, all with their own designs, histories, and social standings. 9 would be impressive in its own right, but it's the way these different races interact with one another that provides the world with some cultural identity, even if it is misguided. You see, life for the Elda, Clamar, Ruzant, Ujif, Parapis, Mustari, Nydia, Ishki, and Rogue are not created equal. From the opening hours of the game, you come to realize the racial strife of this world, with tribes like the Clamar, Rusant, and Ishkia often viewing others like the Parapis, Ujif, and Elda as being lesser than themselves. This overwhelming racial disparity takes root across the game world, helping to give the injustices of this world a harsher sting. For example, often the leaders of the church or royalty belong to those so-called more desirable tribes like the Clamar or the Ruzant. In rare cases, those in other tribes are able to aspire to high positions like Lady Rella, the saint healer of the church and member of the Nydia tribe, but often they are left in working class jobs as laborers, or even worse, left unemployed to die in the slums. The Parapis and Mustari in particular are often viewed with great disdain. The Parapis take on beast-like qualities to their appearance, and this often gets them stereotyped as being more feral than civilized. Often they are subjected to vile experimentation to test new technologies, as it's the only way for them to make a living. Meanwhile, the Mustari are an indigenous folk often viewed as pagan barbarians by the theological members of the so-called advanced society. And these examples are but a small snippet of how these 9 tribes interact with one another and how that defines their everyday life. You can really get a real sense of the worldview of these people through their tribe association alone. Needless to say, this heavy racial divide generates much conflict and contention within society. You have the ruling elite tribes often looking down on those of lesser status, not willing to employ them, or viewing them as people in need of saving instead of as equals with different appearances and worldviews. This constant discrimination builds animosity within the lower tribes, often resulting in uprisings against those in power or complete isolation away from it all. These social standings are constantly reinforced in dialogue throughout the game, along with the structure of the world. For example, you'll hear it directly from your companions and other NPCs, but you'll also live it as you travel the world, seeing things like a UG village completely isolating itself from nearby trade partners out of fear of racial disharmony. It is this direct and indirect presentation of the world's largest defining factor, its 9 tribes, that helps convey the culture to the player throughout the journey, strengthening the resolve of the hero that you play as. That's right, the main protagonist of this adventure belongs to the Elda tribe, the lowest of the low, often viewed as the most heinous and awful tribe, although you don't see it play out as often, considering you're one of the few remaining members. Despite all the backlash against your character, you dream of utopia, a world where all the tribes live in harmony, a perfect democracy where differences are acknowledged but not punished by law or cultural norms. And who better to accomplish that than an Elda like yourself? Turns out the rightful heir to the throne is a friend of yours, a bastard child of the king, and an Elda, the worst of the worst according to those at the top. In his youth, this would-be prince was cursed by an unknown group, no doubt seeking to keep an Elda off the throne someday. That prince was long believed dead by the land's population, but your character and your companions know the truth, that he lives and is in need of a curse-breaking magic that can restore him to good health and fuel his campaign for king. Obstacles abound across the journey to see this far-fetched fantasy become reality, as I will detail in the next section. But for now, what can I say? The team at Atlus has done a tremendous job of conjuring up such a fantastic world. Fantasy in presentation, but inspired by the reality of our world, particularly the negative elements that push us apart instead of binding us together. Any player, especially those living in the United States, will be able to draw immediate parallels between this world and our own, which, in my opinion, boosted the strength of the political and cultural commentary the game provides, as it delivers a wholehearted endorsement of unity through shared understanding and trust. Without a doubt, this has been one of my favorite game worlds to not necessarily explore, but to learn about as I played, wanting to know more about each tribe as individuals, but also how they coalesced into such a broken society ruled by the fear of the unknown. Usually, I'd transition into a look at the gameplay next, but the world building in the story goes so hand in hand that I feel I must tackle that portion next. Beware, this is the segment where spoilers will abound. They must if I am to share my full thoughts. At the heart of Metaphor Refantazio's narrative is a message about the importance of balancing individual willpower, belief, and faith with the beauty of varied perspectives. You must hold tight to your own beliefs, but those beliefs must not trample upon others to create a place to stand tall. It's a story that frames good and evil as a race, where one side looks to build up walls while the other seeks to tear them down. And in the end, it champions the notion that coming together through shared beliefs and trust is the only way to combat the fear and anxiety that often manipulates us into division. It is unapologetically allegorical for our own world, while continuously instilling the player with hope throughout its plot points, whether they come in moments of great success or tragic failure. So let's see how this all plays out. I won't be recapping every major story beat verbatim, but it's important to establish what's going on here. As previously mentioned, Uchronia is a world in need of a new king, after its current one is assassinated by a man named Luis. At the story's beginning, you know only that Luis seeks the throne for himself, and that you aim to stop him by re-establishing the Cursed Prince's claim as the rightful heir. Of course, there's many obstacles in your way. A powerful and magical edict rises from the king's death, declaring that the new king must earn that role through support of the people. No one person can take the throne by force, but instead, it will be elected by the people's will after a few months of campaigning across the lands. For you and your party members, the objective becomes twofold: find a way to break the curse, keeping the prince imprisoned, and to share his message of unity and tribal peace amongst the people so that he may find the support to retake the throne. Throughout this journey, the game isn't afraid to touch on many contemporary issues facing our world today, such as racism, as I've established, but also child loss, exploitation of political power, abuse of religious faith, corrupt business ethics, propaganda, how fear and anxiety limit perspectives, and general mass manipulation of citizens, amongst other topics. I could go into great detail on all of these, such as how the high-ranking religious officials push the use of igniters, which are magic conduits that are often used as weapons, encouraging people to buy them, suppressing the reality that magic can be used without one. Or how discrimination segments the population, forcing these so-called lesser tribes into small village think tanks where no new ideas are ever considered, such as on Virga Island, where the Mustari keep sacrificing their own in the name of tribal tradition. It's not until you arrive and open the eyes of the newest sacrifice, Yufa, that she turns her back on ascribed fate to instead explore the world and learn of other perspectives, evolving her island's culture in the process. But the topic that struck me most was child loss, a sub-theme that plays out throughout the main story in the form of the king losing his son the prince, but also in smaller instances like the introduction to Haizme, a wonderful character and friend. This companion is first introduced as a heinous threat who kidnaps children from the village of Martira and brings them to his hidden fortress deep in dangerous sandworm territory. Your squad goes to stop him as a showing of good faith to the people and attempt to gain more support, but what you uncover is a completely different picture. You come to realize that Haizme is a former knight, isolating himself away from everyone, even his own tribe mates in the Ujif, wishing only death for himself. He's no kidnapper, he's been framed. He's actually just a broken father, unable to get past the grief of losing his son after failing to protect him against a bloodthirsty mob. His son perished to the crowd while Haizme served his duty as a Shadow Knight, and he feels an unshakable guilt about that loss. He welcomes death, that is, until you meet him and begin sharing the prince's vision for a better world, one of equality, one where his son would not have died so needlessly. It's touching in its own right, but it's not until you complete this area's dungeon that the picture becomes fully clear. The real kidnapper is the ruler of the village, a woman named Joanna, who lost her own child in similar circumstances. Equally unable to deal with her grief, she nurtures a monstrous beast that takes the form of an infant, trying to replace her lost child with this creature. She kidnaps children and feeds them to this beastly child to keep it growing, thus perpetuating the cycle of grieving parents, all in some misguided way to make herself feel better while punishing the cruel world around her. She breaks other families, ruining individuals, all as a protest to society's glaring racial divides. And all of this comes to a head after your fight, in an exchange between Joanna, Haizme, and the rest of the party. It provides an emotionally charged scene where the two parents break down their struggles. Haizme himself describes in gruesome detail what happened to his son and how he felt shattered afterwards, a failure who couldn't protect his own child. But then he speaks about how this group and their support has encouraged him to no longer linger in that pain, but instead to live on for his son's memory. Recognizing that the conflict that robbed him of his son would continue if change wasn't pushed. Not wanting others to live through his pain, Haizme chooses to fight for a better future beside you. It's poignant, it's raw, and it's uncensored, giving tremendous commentary on the struggle of losing a child and the unimaginable willpower it takes to carry on. This tragic topic is handled with nuance and grace without shying away from the very real pain, leading to a resonating emotional sub-theme. It's superb writing intermingling with the thoughtful world and the character design, and Metaphor Refantazio is full of moments like this throughout the journey. And keep in mind, this isn't even that relevant to the overall plot, it's but another moment that helps convey the nature of this world's people. While I'd say Hazme has the most emotionally charged moments of the main story, your other companions offer tales of loss and resiliency as well. I won't get into their social link stories quite yet, or harp on their roles in the main story, but each of them, in part, is defined by loss. Hulkenberg is a disgraced royal knight who failed to protect the prince on the night he was cursed. Stroll is the son of fallen nobility, his entire village being wiped off the map after an attack from a human. Juna loses her adopted sister and a close friend. Yufa loses her sense of purpose in life after discovering her island's sacrificial traditions are not but a hoax. And then there's Basilio. Poor Basilio. He loses his older brother, the person who has guided him most in life, leaving him aimless. Loss plays a role in all of these characters' lives, but through interacting with you and the other party members, they come to see the light and find that inner strength to carry on, once again lending credence to the theme of persevering and strengthening your own will and convictions. Understanding these characters as people, seeing their struggles, and admiring their spirit to carry on is what allows you to see them as true humans despite their appearances. Having a tail, wings, horns, or a different color skin tone matters a whole lot less when sympathy and empathy have taken root in your heart. And to me, that is why Metaphor Refantazio does so well with its character building, establishing backstories, and building proper growth arcs. Of course, Metaphor handles its writing of the villains with the same level of care and detail, and that's a good point to segue back into the overall story. After traveling the lands, meeting these party members, and helping them through their struggles, the character-driven portions take a backseat to the overall plot. Throughout the story, many antagonists stand against you, whether it's a Luis supporter named Zorba, the leader of the crowned theocracy Sanctifex Forden, who seeks the throne for himself, other aspirants to the throne misguided in their own ways, or even Joanna, who I just went over. Each of them provides necessary conflict to the story in ways big and small, especially Forden, leading to a fascinating political drama portion of the story about 3/4 of the way through. Seriously, this segment had me on the edge of my seat for like 2 to 3 hours straight. If you've played the game, you know what I mean, but it seems unnecessary to spoil it here. But at the top of the hit list is Luis, the man who killed the king and is believed to have cursed the prince. Luis is arguably the best written antagonist I've encountered in a video game since, well, ever? Like, who compares to him? Maybe Dutch in Red Dead Redemption 2, or Sephiroth in Final Fantasy VII. Let the comparison to those names provide you some context for the level of character writing on display here. Throughout the first 90% of your journey, you see Luis for the rival and villain that he is, campaigning for a world where power rules all. When he is king, only those with strength and might will take on positions of power. It's a message that resonates with some of the people, particularly the Parapists, who are often viewed as the scum of society, but are also biologically some of the strongest. When you've been kicked down your whole life, it only feels right to support someone who seeks to level the playing field. The problem, though, is that Luis's equality is built on power, not through understanding and trust. Luis is conniving, smart, strong, and well articulated, stealing the scene every time he shows up with almost zero exceptions. It's hard not to respect his convictions and fortitude even when he stands in contrast for what the party believes in. Throughout the entire story, he remains one step ahead of the party, knowing every move you will make before you do. Your party works within the shadows to try to kill him, hoping that that will break the curse, but Luis sees through the charades almost every time. He absolutely dominates the scenes he's in and carries a tremendous aura around him. And then, after that 90% of the game, you start to learn of his backstory and his true intentions. Luis, like you, is an Elda who saw his village burned needlessly by the crowned theocracy and Sanctifex Forden, all while the broken king stood powerless, consumed by depression over the loss of his son. You almost become sympathetic towards Luis, understanding why he seeks to end the injustices of the world. He saw everything and everyone he grew up with slaughtered simply because the higher-ups felt threatened by the tribe and their potential to one day take the throne. For a child to sustain that level of loss in a world full of people who already despise him simply for the tribe he was born into is sort of heartbreaking. Luis is just another broken product of the world he inhabits and the mindset of its people and its political systems. But yet, he still must be stopped. Our party comes to understand why Luis behaves the way that he does, but even so, they can't support his ultimate plan. Luis seeks to end injustice in the world, just like we do, but he wants to do that by ending humanity. You and Luis come to learn that all the 9 tribes are descendants of us, the actual humans playing the game. Through destructive wars, humanity lost themselves, isolating in pockets of the world, evolving into the 9 tribes you find in-game. Luis seeks a world where we all go back to being humans, but unfortunately, he refers to the mindless beasts that you've spent the whole game fighting, creatures overcome with fear and anxiety and devoid of civilized behavior. Luis's promise to build a world where only the strong survive was true, but it's not the utopia the people envisioned. It's a destroyed world where only those with strength of will can resist losing their humanity. It's a bleak world that we obviously must stand against. For the prince's vision, or should I say the main character's vision, that's right, they're one and the same, to come to pass, a great inner will must be nourished. To achieve our goal and defeat Luis, bonds will be established, death will be overcome, an entire false utopia must be pushed away. It is the prince's vision that injustice in the world can only end through unification, people coming to understand one another through compassion, sympathy, empathy, and trust. He seeks to build a world like that, where people consider the realities of others as often as they do their own. It's easy to hear a message like that and find it hopelessly romantic or a complete fantasy, a notion that the game itself acknowledges. Even after your victory, not everyone in the world is happy-go-lucky, wanting to love their neighbor and overlook all racial differences. No, not at all. Instead, there's still dissenters who oppose your rule, but yet you carry on with conviction for them just as much as your followers. Will, the in-universe name for the main character, and a fitting name by the way, embodies this determination by always being there to support others. They leave room for you, the player, to insert yourself into his shoes, so he isn't a super strong character in his own right, but it's sort of like the developers are nudging you to be the good guy. Be a force for good in this world by unifying it, not dividing it. And I think that's a solid message that should carry over into our real world, regardless of any one person's race, faith, sex, or income. Just be good to other people, that's it. And all of this comes to a head in the final outing between Will and Luis. Both characters are shown to have strong convictions, equally matching each other in might as individuals, but it's Will that's able to prevail because he is not alone. Yes, the power of friendship, that standard JRPG trope, is a part of Metaphor Refantazio, but I think it fits well here given the global stakes of the story. This isn't just some high school friends becoming closer, it's about uniting an entire nation full of diverse people. It makes for a fitting end to the story, and it's one that kept me hooked as I played over 80 hours. Strong character writing, meaningful commentary on important subject matter, the political drama, and the good-natured theme is what grants the story and its world so much weight and impact. It's awesome. Really, the only negative I can lobby at the story would be its reliance on conveniences at times. There's a few moments that took me out of the story, like Stroll having an outburst right to Luis's face about how the would-be king let his entire village be destroyed by a human. At the time of this encounter, the party is working for Luis, trying to sabotage him from within, but Luis doesn't know that. And then you get this moment where Stroll kind of jeopardizes the whole thing, and Luis just punches back with a few lines about sending a message and whatnot, and then that's it. It's hard for me to believe that Luis would continue to trust Stroll, and by extension the party after this, but it's just glossed over. Going hand in hand with that would be the group's trip to Virga Island, where everything just goes a little too conveniently. Especially this part where they're all busted out of jail by Del and Basilio in such a comically simple way, and then having the entire island go from hating them to supporting them. The story overreaches a few times like this, in my opinion, but nothing that takes away from the heart and soul that's felt throughout this otherwise strong narrative. And with that, let's transition into looking at the gameplay. We're going to start with everything outside of combat, like social links and social stats, but make no mistake, it genuinely feels like all of the main systems of the Persona games have been brought over and evolved in thoughtful ways. Perhaps the most important system that's been brought over is the calendar structure, where each day that isn't defined by a story event is free for the player to do as they wish. This includes doing things like entering a dungeon, traveling to a new town, hanging out with a companion, or doing an activity that raises social stats, called Royal Virtues here. You can complete 2 of these events each day before it concludes, and a new dawn brings new possibilities. Social stats return in Metaphor and must be steadily plugged away at to achieve max ranks. Maxing them all allows you to pass barriers in the social links. For example, a character might not be available to advance their questline until you reach, say, Imagination at rank 3 or Tolerance at rank 5. In the Persona games, getting these stats up often felt like a slog, repeating the same tasks over and over again, trying to max them out as quickly and as efficiently as possible. Luckily, Metaphor improves this system in a few ways. The simplest would be that certain activities in the mid and late game offer more points towards those stats. For example, giving a speech rewards both eloquence and imagination points at the same time, whereas certain books may allocate 6 or 7 points instead of the usual 4. This alone means you'll have to spend less time grinding them out. Oh, and you can also earn stat points through completing other activities, like bounties that award courage, or completing Moore's requests in academia that generate imagination. And with traveling between towns being such a large component of the game structure, you'll often have time while riding your massive gauntlet runner to grind out these stats by reading, playing games with Hawkenberg, or sharpening your weapons with Stroll, amongst other things. Since social links are rarely available while you're traveling, it makes this time go unwasted. You still have a purpose with it. As a result of these methods, it's never been easier to max rank your social stats, and that's really appreciated. You feel like you're getting them as bonuses instead of having to dedicate proper time slots towards them, and that makes them feel so much easier to achieve. And that brings us to the social links, which have been streamlined for the better here. Metaphor's narrative takes place over a much shorter period of time compared to the Persona games, which initially had me concerned that I wouldn't be able to finish all the social links. Boy was I wrong. Each companion only has 8 ranks instead of the usual 10, which already saves a ton of time, but thankfully there's no fluff within them. You don't have to match a Persona's Arcana or any of that kind of crap here, and there will never be an instance in which you spend time with a companion and their story does not advance. You know when you're playing a Persona game and you decide to hang out with somebody, and at the end you get that message that says, "Oh, our friendship will probably be taken to the next level soon," to indicate that you're about to rank up next time? Well, you never have to deal with that here. And it's awesome. When you dedicate time to a character, you know with certainty that you'll be getting the next bit of their story, and that's awesome. My initial fear of not having enough time to finish all the social links was met with laughs when I had about 25 in-game days left, and had already completed all of them except Basilio's last 2 ranks. And the best part was, I didn't even have to use a guide, and there's something so nice about that. Sure, I didn't get every trophy on my first run, but I got so much more out of the experience by making my own choices. In Persona 3 Reload, I followed a guide, and it felt so mechanical with only a platinum trophy as a reward instead of an awesome playthrough defined by my own choices. I didn't want that for Metaphor, so I played without one, knowing that I could miss out, but that worry never came to fruition, and that was so awesome. So the structure of social links are pretty good, but are they comprised of interesting characters? The answer to that is a resounding yes, as most of the social links do a grand job of conveying a character arc while also tying back into the combat occasionally. Let me show you what I mean by using Basilio as an example. When you first meet him, this Parapus is actually working as one of Luis's enforcers alongside his older brother, Fidelio. You come to realize that, while both of them are capable in battle, that Del is the brains and Basilio is mostly tagging along. However, as the brothers spend more time with you on an excursion, their faith in Luis wavers as they become more interested in your message. In a confrontation with the big bad himself, Fidelio sacrifices himself to save a family, leaving Basilio in shambles, but he eventually awakens to his inner strength, his archetype, which is the Persona equivalent of this game. All of that happens in the main story, but then Basilio becomes a companion that you can spend time with. His story details his background, how he and Del grew up poor and were forced to work under the Crown theocracy, serving as subjects for Igniter experimentation. He, his brother, and many other Parapus were essentially kept hostage and tortured during this time, with many of them dying outright or carrying lasting consequences into their adult lives. Even Basilio himself is shown to still struggle with the physical pain, such as on this trip to Brylehaven. It's here where you meet a former friend of Basilio named Vinca. He offers our friend medicine and kind words over the loss of his brother, but as you progress the story, you learn that Vinca is on a dark path. He's going around murdering those involved with the Igniter business, and it puts Basilio in a pinch. He understands Vinca's pain, but he can't justify his actions, and he's left wondering what his brother Fidelio would have done. Eventually, through your support, he finds the inner strength to confront Vinca, who falls into a deep madness, forcing a fight. And this is where the combat ties in, as you must find Vinca in a dungeon and defeat him with Basilio in your party, triggering the next rank of the social link. It unifies 2 of the biggest pillars of this style of games, dungeon crawling and social links, and that's awesome. The fight forces action out of Basilio, and it stems from his own will, giving him resolve to carry on without needing Del alongside of him every step of the way. He vows to fight on alongside of you while carrying the spirit of Del, Vinca, and all the Parapus who have suffered. It's a touching moment and a pretty good social link that found ways to tie the combat mechanics directly into it. And that's so cool. It feels like an evolution of the social links that have come before. Now, keep in mind, not every social link does this, but they still maintain interesting stories that flesh out the characters you meet along your journey. The highlights for me were Haizme and his goal to find a proper final resting place for his son, Katarina and her change from a Robin Hood-esque character to one who recognizes that stealing creates a vicious cycle that further divides the 9 tribes. I also enjoyed Alonso the Trickster, who gives his own life to see your goal recognized. Or does he? And finally, Lady Juna, who learns to cope with her past traumas while learning to understand the pain of others. And if you've played this game, I'd love to hear your favorite social link in the comments below. Truth be told, I thought all of them had quality writing and stories, none that were actively bad or poorly implemented. Sure, some were less interesting on a personal level, like Strolls and Bardens, but maybe that's just me. While their character developments provide an intrinsic satisfaction to uncover, the extrinsic rewards you receive for advancing social links cannot be overlooked. Seriously, there's some pretty great rewards for advancing social links, such as starting battles on the Gauntlet Runner with a barrage against your opponent, dealing massive damage, or cheaper prices at shops, or being gifted care packages randomly that contain money and items. And of course, advancing your party member's social link rewards you handsomely as well, with unique character perks, as well as cheaper rates to access their archetypes for yourself. The presentation of the social links in Metaphor is astounding, an advancement of what we've seen before, owing to the fat trimming that bloats them in Persona games. The only real negative I can lobby against them is that not every rank is fully voice acted, which sucks after playing Persona 3 Reload, which had that luxury. That aside, the structure and stories of social links, as well as how they inform the world's cultural dynamics, clear what I've experienced in every Persona game outside of maybe Persona 4. Depends on the day that you ask me. The social links here are well worth your time. So that's the social link pillar. Now let's hop over to look at combat. First up, let's talk dungeon design because I think it's the one area where Metaphor takes a step back from the most recent Persona game, Persona 5. There's two types of dungeons. Some are tied to the main story, and others are optional areas that often harbor items and enemies unique to the game's side quests. Let's start with the main dungeons, and truth be told, they don't feel nearly as handcrafted as they did in Persona 5. Yes, both games contain linear dungeons, but those in P5 had more flair, as well as puzzles that felt like set pieces. At the same time, those dungeons were a psychological reflection of the person the Phantom Thieves were trying to change. It gave insight to the villains, and that alone made them more interesting than anything you find here. Metaphor Refantazio feels decidedly closer to Persona 4, where the dungeon emphasizes a visual motif like sewers or a castle, but it's ultimately just a series of hallways. Now, they're not quite as simple as Persona 4, they do contain puzzles, but unlike the ones in Persona 5 that felt fun to solve, these often felt either frustrating or tedious. For example, in the segment where you're recruiting Yuffie, there's this giant labyrinth that has many blocked paths, but you won't know if a path is unlocked or locked until you approach them. It leads to a lot of sprinting around just trying to find the correct path. Or this section late in the game where mud slows your pace while monsters chase you down. That's not to say these are horrible, but they do feel like a step back from those in Persona 4, at least in my mind. To their credit, they are much easier to complete in a single day versus those found in Persona 5, as many of them are shorter, especially after completing the very first one. For my money, it's a tie between the first one, where you have to go into the broken Grand Cathedral, or the infiltration into Luisa's ship for the best in the game, with the latter feeling pretty unique, a series of mini-bosses that must be defeated. All in all, dungeons were still designed well, but they didn't quite live up to the heights of P5. Optional dungeons are also included, and I can appreciate that. They give the player an opportunity to grind out experience while completing various objectives, like requests from local townfolks or bounties posted by the army. The rewards tied to these optional dungeons are what makes them worthwhile, as on their own, they are rather uninspired and do get repeated multiple times. For example, there's 3 of the same tower, as well as repeated locations like forests and tombs. Visually, these areas rarely feel distinct from one another, while also not offering up any sort of alternate objectives, such as puzzle solving. The greatest contribution of these optional dungeons ends up being how much extra content they add onto the experience, and I can't really knock the game for that. Asking the team to spend loads of time developing intricate dungeons that remain optional is a bit much, but that doesn't mean that what we got doesn't end up feeling a little stale after repeated visits. But you know what makes up for the lesser dungeon design? Literally everything else having to do with combat, whether it's fights themselves or the character building. It's criminal that I've waited this long to talk about it because this game truly feels like an evolution of Persona 5's one more turn-based combat. I'm assuming that if you've made it this far into the video, you're familiar with that system. You know, standard turn-based combat where landing a critical hit or striking an enemy's weakness grants you one extra turn. That foundation remains in place here, but Metaphor takes it so much farther, owed to 3 awesome advancements. We're gonna break down each, but they include overworld combat, lane shifting, and by far the most important element, the replacement of personas with archetypes. The first 2 aren't quite as dramatic as the last, so let's start with those. In Metaphor Refantazio, you don't have to engage in a traditional turn-based fight called squad battles with every single enemy. Instead, you can deal damage to them in the overworld. Now, yes, you could do this in Persona 5. If you overlevel them enough, you'd just instantly kill them. But this is more of a battle. If you outlevel them significantly, you will knock them out quickly, again, just like Persona 5, rewarding you instantly. However, if they are on the same page as you, or even higher, you'll do a bit of chip damage to them, and they'll start a counterattack. This becomes a cat and mouse game, as if you hit them enough times, you can stagger them. In this scenario, when you begin the squad battle, you get a big advantage. All the enemies will be stunned, paralyzing them on their first round, essentially giving you 2 free rounds to attack before they can do anything. However, if they manage to strike you first, they start the battle with an advantage, attacking you before you get a chance to do anything. Of course, you can opt to initiate a squad battle at any point in the overworld encounter, meaning you still have full control. It becomes a gamble, especially against those higher level enemies. Do you keep poking at them, trying to secure the stagger, or just start the fight right away to avoid being struck first? It adds a layer of strategy to the combat while also allowing you to skip past fights that are beneath you, and that's great. Another interesting inclusion would be the lane shifting mechanic found within those squad battles. Your party can either align in the front or in the back and can shift between them freely on their individual turn. Being at the front boosts melee damage but reduces defense, while the opposite happens if you retreat to the back line. In some of the game's tougher boss fights, your decisions here really matter because leaving someone up front might see them get killed, whereas they would have survived if they were in the back. Or, when an enemy's health is low, do you risk sending a person to the front line to try to land the killing blow, knowing that if you don't succeed, they're at risk of dying themselves? It's another layer for the player to consider, adding more depth to this already deep combat system. But what really elevates this combat to incredible heights would be the archetypes, the replacement for personas that provide an unbelievable amount of options for team composition and overall approaches to combat. Buckle in, this is going to be a long explanation. Alright, so archetypes. In universe, these are heroic embodiments of ancient people who lived with strong virtues, and those who wield those same virtues and strength of heart can wield their power. They include pretty standard RPG roles like healers, tanks, melee beaters, and ranged mages, but also some pretty unique ones like merchants who attack by spending your money, the faker who specializes in buffs and debuffs, and summoners who, well, summon entities to do damage. And these are all tied to the social links, as meeting a new character unlocks their archetype to be studied. In total, there's 14 base archetypes, but each of them can be leveled up either once or twice upon reaching rank 20. So, for example, the Thief archetype from Heisme evolves into the Assassin, who then evolves into the Ninja. These are 3 distinct archetypes, but they're all a part of the same lineage. As you level up an archetype, they of course learn new skills, but when you take that evolutionary step, you get stronger moves. So for example, the Thief starts with a dark move that does weak damage, but then the Assassin gets access to like medium damage dark moves, and then finally the Ninja gets access to the harder hitting dark moves. It's almost like going from Ember to Flamethrower to Fire Blast in a Pokemon game. Hopefully that's a brief overview of how archetypes function. You pick one, you level it up through fights, and then evolve them into more powerful versions. Each party member can only wield one archetype at a time, but here's the beauty. Every single party member can access any archetype at any time so long as you have the currency, called Magla, to unlock them. I cannot understate how dramatically this evolves Persona's standard combat. It's like every single party member here is a wild card, like only the main character is in the Persona games. You can build your character however you want, allocating stats as you see fit, but your other party members tend to fall into predefined roles like healers, mages, and melee beaters. But again, the beauty is that you still get to choose which archetypes they wield. Like, sure, Stroll is mostly focused on melee, but melee works with so many different archetypes, like brawlers, warriors, and commanders. Stroll's base skills can be applied properly to various archetypes, which grants you a ton of opportunity to express yourself. You have the freedom to choose which lineage each character will take, giving you virtually unlimited options when building your party. At the same time, there's a system called skill inheritance that allows for further customization. Say I want to keep Stroll at his base archetype, the warrior, and evolve it further. But at the same time, I really love the formation shifts granted by the commander lineage. So long as I've advanced the commander archetype far enough to learn those moves, I can copy and paste them onto Stroll's warrior archetype. It's like picking all of your moves a la carte, which gives even more flexibility to team crafting. And if this wasn't enough, late in the game you can unlock royal archetypes, which, if I'm sticking with the Pokemon evolution analogy, is like a permanent mega evolution. They get access to the strongest moves and best passive abilities in the game, and that's just really cool. It feels like you're constantly unlocking new archetypes or moves to try out, and since there's so many optional dungeons and tons of free extra time, your opportunity to experiment is high. This alone would be a significant upgrade to what we see in Persona games. Fully unlocking your party members' potential and placing that in your hands is a monumental advancement of what's come before. But Metaphor takes things even further with its synergy mechanic. Every archetype will unlock synergy abilities if you stack them, meaning multiple party members carrying the same archetype. But other synergies exist as well, allowing you to access these powerful moves without having to repeat archetypes. These synergy abilities are powerful moves that often deal severe damage, a higher amount of damage than you can achieve on your own at the cost of 2 turn icons. These were really helpful throughout the game, being able to turn the tide of tough battles while also giving you new things to experiment with each time you change up your party composition. It's like if those special team-up flashy moves from Persona 5 Royal were accessible whenever you want them and with a lot more practicality. My only point of contention here is that they can certainly trivialize the early game. Severe damage just wipes out bosses in the first dungeon or two. But between all of these factors, you take what was already a really solid and enjoyable turn-based combat system and hand over the keys to the player, allowing them to craft whatever team composition they want. Do you want a standard team that balances damage, healing, and tanks? Sure, go ahead, run a warrior, knight, healer, and seeker. Do you want your party to be a series of ranged attackers focusing on different elemental affinities? No one is stopping you from having a gunner, merchant, mage, and summoner. Do you want to challenge yourself by limiting your party to one archetype? Go right ahead, get wild and have a group of masked dancers. That freedom to experiment is easily felt throughout your first playthrough, and it gives tons of incentives to revisit the game a second time and beyond if you want to go after all the trophies, or to experience the story again, or just to test your skills on hard mode. Of course, there's more to combat preparation than just setting your archetypes, as every character needs to be equipped with weapons, armors, and charms that all provide meaningful buffs, as well as passive abilities like increasing your chances of stealing successfully, or adding a fire attack to your base skill set. Truth be told, there is a level of management to this combat system, constantly making sure your party is equipped with the best gear available while also shuffling around archetypes and skills as needed. It can be a bit daunting sometimes, which leads me to my only real criticism with combat. That being that sometimes the boss fights will be made leagues harder if you show up with the wrong archetypes, forcing you to slog through it or restarting from the last checkpoint. Now, to be fair, this is mitigated in many instances by intel that the player can purchase from taverns and inns. This is nice, but I did have a few instances where I had to give up on a fight after 15 to 20 minutes of attempts and restart to shuffle around my loadout. Maybe that's to be expected though in a game that grants this many options. Not everything can be perfectly balanced. The game isn't overly challenging on normal difficulty, a few tough battles here and there, but usually good preparation results in easier battles. Bump it up to hard mode if you want to push yourself. And one last thing I wanted to add is that this game is so merciful with its combat rewards. Another way that this game shows mastery over doling out bonuses throughout its many systems. You have your standard money and experience rewards along with items, but then there's also the magla that's awarded to you. If a party member is equipped with an archetype at max rank, you still earn the points needed to rank up. They just give you an item instead of raw experience. This is brilliant, allowing you to level up archetypes much faster than you otherwise would. For example, I kept Hawkenberg in the Knight lineage for like the entire playthrough, and every time she ranked up, I got an item that could be used to boost the rank of any of her other archetypes or any other party members' archetypes. A simple but supremely useful mechanic that encourages experimentation instead of suppressing it. With all of these factors considered, I have no choice but to say that Metaphor Refantazio features the best combat system I've experienced from Atlus yet, albeit I've only played this and Personas 3 through 5. It's the same great one more system, but ballooned without bloat, granting you tons of opportunity for player expression through individual character building as well as team composition. If Persona 6 doesn't feature something similar, it will no doubt feel like a lesser game than this, at least when it comes to combat. Of all the impressive components that make up Metaphor Refantazio, I have a feeling that presentation might end up being one of its weaker elements. Now, hold up, that's not to say that the game has major flaws, bugs, or bad graphics and sound work. No, not at all. It's just that this art style includes many striking elements that really impress, but also a few decisions that I believe take away from the presentation in mostly minor ways, but those ways do stack. However, right up front I have to say the painted look of the game is stunning. The idea of fantasy becoming reality is such a strong core element of the narrative, and the paint-like quality helps convey that. It's imagery in the painter's mind being brought to life through animation and voice work. It is fantasy becoming real. It's awesome, and I think it looks great most of the time. While there are moments of inspired beauty, a lot of the game world has its aesthetic drained through the use of more subdued colors that don't pop or stand out. I'm sure this was done intentionally, but I couldn't help but to find it a little dull at times. I found this to be mostly true in the dungeons, especially the optional ones that lacked a sense of flair compared to the rest of the game world, and especially compared to the character designs. And I think that's where the art direction shines brightest, the characters. It's not easy to come up with 9 different variations of a human that all feel distinct from one another, but still recognizable as being based off of us. And yet, the team did just that, including striking features like the Clamar's horns, the hairs of the Parapus, and, well, the entire Ujif tribe. They're the least looking like humans, but they still feel human. It's great. These designs go hard. They're some of the most inventive I've seen from games in a long time. Overall, I don't think anyone's going to find this art direction particularly bad. In fact, many will find it to be great, but I do think its flaws stand out a little bit here and there. There are moments that feel like the game isn't taking full advantage of the hardware. In terms of sound work, the title absolutely excels on every front. The voice acting is varied and inspired. I love that each main character has a different accent from one another, a simple but effective way to highlight the differences between each tribe. Each character uses terms and expressions consistently, demonstrating some variation amongst one shared language, again, supporting the differences of the tribes. Going beyond the voice acting though, we have the music, and my god, it's another slam dunk from Atlus. Do they ever miss when it comes to the OSTs? Granted, I thought Reloads was a little weaker than normal, but still good. But this is a return to excellence, and it's incredible. The battle theme goes hard, and if you've watched this channel a lot, you know that I am a sucker for simple piano intros, and this game has one. The vocals and the music are hypnotizing and melodic too, and the sounds of string and brass instruments weave in so nicely, giving the whole soundtrack an anchor to build upon. It is just so good, and I've been listening to it as background music the entire time that I wrote this script. Usually I listen to this video, this Persona 5 Jazz Cafe music with rain ambience. It's a good video too, but now I feel like I've upgraded. The soundtrack here is magical. And generally, the sound effect work is good too, although it did get really annoying hearing the same voice lines over and over again as I zipped around the cities riding my sword. They repeat ad nauseum, like, shut up already. In terms of bugs and glitches, I didn't have any. Games from Atlus rarely feature any to my knowledge, and this game continues that trend. My only other complaints are more nitpicks than anything, elements that I'd like to see improved in a sequel. For example, Persona 3 Reload did a masterful job of placing relevant items at the top of your inventory list, but Metaphor does not, leading to a lot of shuffling through menus to find certain status affliction heals or debuff items. Also, you're able to convert Magla into money in this game, but there's no way to do the opposite, which was frustrating. By the end of the game, I had so much money with nothing to spend it on. I desperately wanted to convert it to Magla so that I could flesh out a few more archetypes, but no luck. And as aforementioned, I would love it if every rank of the social links were all fully voice acted next time around. These are but some minor issues that don't detract greatly from this game, just things that they could improve on. Anyway, the presentation and performance on my PlayStation 5 was really good. I think some will poke holes in the art direction, not loving it as much as others, but clearly it's excellent in the eyes of most. It won the Game Award for that category last year, after all. A few examples of weaker visuals cannot rob the game of that. It would be easy to chalk up Metaphor Refantazio's success to the idea that expectations for it were lower. Another RPG spin-off for us to chew on while the main course of Persona 6 continues to be cooked up. But I don't think that explanation does this game justice. Metaphor Refantazio is not an appetizer. It's a meal that will fill you up and saying no to dessert afterwards. It accomplishes this by making sure its pillars of design are strong while reinforcing one another. A brand new fantasy world has been crafted and placed in front of you with thorough opportunities to learn about its mystical locations, diversified people, and the problems that plague the culture. All of this is uncovered while experiencing a story steeped in optimism about humanity's future without shying away from the ugly sides of society, handling troublesome topics with dignity and nuance. It introduces you to characters that you will come to adore and appreciate in the same way that you have with Atlus characters of the past. On its own, this would be another great triumph for the company, but Metaphor continues to excel beyond that. Its options for team building are incredibly diversified, more than I've seen from any other Atlus game, owed to the game's archetypes, which empower the player rather than stymieing them. And all of that is shown off with a pronounced sense of quality, highlighted best by the strong art direction and bold soundtrack. Metaphor Refantazio uses all of these strong systems and elements to engulf the player's attention, making you lose track of time whenever you play, while also getting you to think critically about its messages and mechanics when the console is turned off. The decade of the 2020s is now halfway done, and when I think about the best games I played in the last 5 years, it's hard to find competition for this game on a personal level. I think about titles like The Last of Us Part 2, Elden Ring, and Baldur's Gate 3, and while those titles may have had higher highs, they certainly also had lower lows, according to my personal taste. As a result, it's not hard for me to call Metaphor Refantazio the most well-rounded gaming experience that I've had so far in this decade. Perhaps that's enough to jettison it up the list. Hard to say without seeing how time's passing affects my judgment though. Regardless, lumping this game in with other games of such high quality should be evidence of its prowess. I absolutely implore you to check out this game, whether you're a fan of fantasy settings, a lover of Atlus titles, or are just looking for a fun, deep, and meaty RPG to sink your teeth into over the course of a few weeks. Metaphor Refantazio is the best game I played in 2024, and it may just end up being the best game I play this entire decade. Thanks for watching. Alright everyone, I know this video has been a long time coming. By the time I get this out, the game will have already been released for like 4 months, so I appreciate your patience. I had such a great time with it that I didn't want to rush it just to make a video. I've been trying to get away from that method over the last few years, and it's really allowed me to think more critically about games while also still achieving the purpose of any game, to have fun and relax. A novel concept, I know. As for upcoming videos, I'd say the next major one will be a review of Avowed, but I'm sure some tinier projects will probably crop up before then. I also wanted to give an extra special thank you to everyone who's watched the channel to kick off 2025. My updated look at Sly 2 Band of Thieves is my best performing video ever across its first few weeks of publication. That lets me know people are enjoying the Sly content, so I'll be sure to make a video on the Sly 3 emulation at some point, and I'd love to cook up an idea for 5,000 subscribers, like some sort of Sly special. I was thinking something like ranking all the levels and jobs across the entire series from worst to best. I figured that'd be a good special, like a little reward video that would be nice if we're able to hit 5,000 subs. If we do that before year's end, I would love to make that video. Also, if you're interested, I recently launched a channel membership for $5 a month with a few basic perks like early access to videos, channel badges, access to exclusive polls, and having your name featured in the conclusion of videos. I'll be honest with you, these are really simple perks. I'm basically just enabling the join button. If you want to support me a little extra, you can, but really there is no pressure to join. I really just appreciate you watching the videos. That's always been enough for me. And with that, again, thank you for watching this video. Please leave a like if you enjoyed it. Consider subscribing for more. Follow me on Twitter at NopNapNarp, And as always, have a nice day and take care.